not watching a football game. I hope that you guys find this interesting, and feel free to ask me questions afterwards. I guess I'll go ahead and start. I just wanted to say that a lot of this work, a lot of the work that I do is based on this idea of labor. And one of the poems that I find most inspiring in my work is this one by William Carlos Williams. I'll just read it out loud really quickly. It's, so much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chains. And this, as a craftsman, I tend to work a lot with my hands. I tend to depend on this idea of labor and this, and I definitely question what it is that becomes valuable. As a glass person, I work with this ubiquitous material that's, you know, everybody understands, they know, they've seen it around, they use it in their everyday lives. But for me, it's a very difficult thing to do. It's a recording of movement. It's this process that records life. In this show, I've tried to put together a lot of work that brings my art down to one gesture. And that's either a line or a breath or even just the idea of looking. So a lot of this work is newer. I'm primarily an installation artist, but these are kind of newer works that I've never really shown quite in this formal fashion before. So I hope you enjoy it. I'll tell you that this whole show probably started out with these drawings right here. As an exercise, what I did was I ended up making this diary of pebbles, these drawn pebbles, which for me, just this action of drawing a circle was interesting. It was something that the circle created wholeness, but yet it was drawn by a single line. A line that is not necessarily two-dimensional, but a vector. And so when I create a pile, that's something that becomes an imagination of what I think the real world is. How pebbles work, how they're worked, how rocks are formed into something round and tactile and very modular to human interaction. You want to hold it in your hand. And so these piles became this metaphor for thought. It became this metaphor for life for me. And I did this for a year. It got me thinking on how things were interrelated. And so that drew me to this other gesture, the line, the single line. And so I began to think about how these lines could be connected, how they're worked in the world, and that drew me to these lines. For example, here, I started using lines that were connected with triangles and other shapes, but then that got me thinking that, you know, the triangle shape is really important in other works, in structurally significant buildings. Bridges uses this physics type thing, like a truss, and so that's when I started working more on this scale of just triangles. The triangles, this truss form is so solid that that's why it's used in buildings. And so most of these drawings are based on that. One thing connected to another, creating a wholeness that is supposed to be stable. However, I'm using different line lengths And so that gives it this human quality. I'm interested in this idea of wabi-sabi, which is the idea that the Japanese thing where you can create something perfect, but it's not perfect until there's a mark of a human existence in it. And so they throw things off center. That comes into play with this piece, which is 42 lone pebbles that are thrown off. They're one gather, one breath. And so as a trained glassblower, I can make one of these things fairly perfect. I take an extra moment, that extra labor, in heating it up and then coming back to the bench, taking a second and throwing it off center. By adding this mirroring process to it, you can see the world distorted around you and how this imperfectness is around you. That thing goes along with these drawings, which they're all hand-drawn, so I don't use a ruler, and they take hours on end, but I'm trying to create this wholeness with this one gesture. Does anybody have any questions?
How do you feel like these with these drawings? How do you figure when they're done? I mean, when is it doneness for you? I mean, at what juncture? Because that's a question I often ask myself too. You know, when is enough, or when is too much?
That's a good question. I think there's something in your brain where you see something and that looks good, you know? And I have been really editing a lot.
Yeah.
And so sometimes I overwork them and I just end up throwing them out and not liking them. Right? And so it's just this, I think it's just practice.
Yeah, the process.
Yeah, it's a process of knowing when it's done. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's like what a lot of these are too. Like even here, some of these, like every day I do something a little bit different. And so some of them look a lot fuller, some of them are just filled to the brim. And so it's just like this everyday thing that becomes the perfectness.
Yeah, I think the edit is a good point. You know, like practicing the edit is also a very valid practice too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I guess I don't know if I should explain some more of these pieces at all.
When you do like the part of your piece and you sort of make it come out, why did you suggest that?
I think when you take this two-dimensional thing and make it three-dimensional, that I'm playing with that idea because it does create this, because the line is just technically like two-dimensional, it's a vector. But because I'm projecting it a little bit more, I'm playing with that idea of making it become a three-dimensional object, even possibly a four-dimensional thing, because it is process-oriented. That's a very good question, though.
The drawings themselves seem structural, like they could evoke the idea that they become three-dimensional forms. I mean, you were talking about trusses. I could imagine this being a drawing for a large sculpture that would be built of trusses.
Oh, yeah. No, I think that some of the earlier drawings, like that one, suggested a lot more ethereal qualities, like smoke, or even like this rudimentary CAD drawing. And so I think that two-dimensional to three-dimensional, like I guess, flux that it goes in and out of is really important. Of knowing that it's not necessarily just one small thing, but it gets bigger. It can be more. It can be this three-dimensional thing, which can be a stable, like a bridge.
You said you're mostly an installation artist, so what kinds of, do you mostly do glass blowing? Is that what you normally do for installation?
Well, it depends. I've been doing a lot of different other things. Like I started out in glass blowing, and so for me, the glass blowing, the process of glass blowing really informs the way I view an installation like that I'm making. So if it's a response to space or just how I'm interacting with it, even the materials that I'm using. Like this idea of preciousness also is what really drives me, because glass doesn't necessarily evoke preciousness, but it's like what does. It's the material sometimes. And so that's why I'm using like currency, gold leaf, silver leaf in a lot of my work. And it's this very fragile thing. Like people don't want to handle glass necessarily, but they say glass blowers are actually the worst at handling glass because they just break it and they say, I'll make you another one. It's okay. It's that quality of, what is precious, what isn't precious, what do you want to save, what kind of goes away. Like the imperfect is the precious thing, like handmade things versus factory-made things. Your connectedness with another person.
Have you done any stained glass?
I have, yes.
You don't prefer the more form?
I do prefer the more physical aspect of it because of the way that you work with another person sometimes. And so actually, if you guys are interested, I'm doing a demo at Glass Axis after this. So if you want to stay warm, you're welcome to do that. But there, I'll be working with a team of people. And so that in itself is a very process-driven thing where you're working with somebody else. You need to communicate with somebody else and know what's happening. And I think that's really important in the making of my artwork. I like to consider the viewer, I like to consider the work that goes into it. And so because I haven't had access to a studio before, and I started doing these drawings, and when I don't have access to a studio, I do these drawings because of the gesture of either doing something over and over again in glass blowing. Because like you'll practice glass blowing for a really long time till you can become skilled and make that one perfect item. But it's this kind of impermanence, this very, very like not tactile thing for somebody else, I guess, that manifests itself into this one object later on. That
was my question for you. And it was like, did you say you had to work to make them imperfect?
Yeah.
Because you practice so much to get this perfectness, you had to stop and take that.
Yeah, an extra bit of time to make them imperfect.
What is yours? You go ahead.
Use the table for sort of like to hold the glass pieces.
The table is there because it's a presentation. It's a domestic item that for me is very personal. But at the same time, it's a reference towards glass blowing as well. Goblets, things you are deemed one of the most precious things, like the hardest things to do in glass blowing. And so that references kind of the foot, the stem of a glass, and then you have this thing on there, which is kind of 42, kind of like an answer to something.
I've seen some of your earlier work, stuff that is in the show, and I think one of the most consistent things I've noticed about it is this level of obsessiveness. There is an obsession that you have with the physical act of making. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
I think well, I can actually show you this video. I took this video at Pochak when I went there this past summer and took a goblet workshop. And this is actually what he says. And I just thought this was such a beautiful thing. Just to see my gold there, but then and that all of that gold goes into like one small thing. This obsessiveness, I think, comes from this glass blowing thing of trying to make something perfect but not being able to. And so I'm always constantly trying to do more, better, trying to do it again. And working with something so small, like the line, the hand-drawn line, I think I'm trying to make it look something. And that's the question I'm kind of answering, or trying to answer for myself in all of these works. It's like, when is it done? Like, how do you make it whole? How do you make it work something?
So I think that may go along with that, but what was your decision on the scale for this work? Is it important that it's not exceeding about 2 feet by 2 feet?
That, not necessarily. Like, some of my work actually gets a little bit bigger than this. I think for this show, I was trying to work with the space a little bit more and make a cohesive show about the work that I've been doing. Maybe some of this smaller work and quieter things that I've been doing versus the large scale things, which I'm working on my thesis, so that's going to be a large scale thing for sure.
How do you make these after talking all about this making?
How do I make them? Well, have you ever seen glass? You've seen glass blowing.
Yes.
I remember talking to you about this. Well, let's see. After you gather glass on top of it. It's a very long process, and that's the weird thing about glass blowing. It's very team-oriented, because you can't have your own studio without having other people to help you do things. And so, I work out of CCAD right now in their glass studio, and they have this big furnace, basically a big oven with molten glass. It's about 500 pounds of molten glass in this furnace that's about 2,100 degrees. I work in with another thing. It's called a glory hole, but they call it a reheating tool. It's about 2,300 degrees, and it's like a big oven that has a hole in it. And I take this pipe, which is about 5 feet long, preheat it, and then gather up a little bit of that hot glass, that molten glass. Kind of looks like honey, and kind of feels like honey a little bit. But as I have to constantly turn it and watch it, otherwise it falls on the ground. And with just one little gather, I'll make one of these things. It ends up becoming a ball, but I'll blow into it one time and make this big ball. Put a little bit of a jack line, which is how I break it off. It's this little hole right here. But then once it becomes this ball of glass, I heat it up in the big furnace again. And then using either a newspaper that's wet and it's a little moist, I'll like pat it down or use the back of one of my tools, and then I'll just kind of rough it up a little bit so it's not just this perfect round ball. Once I do that, I have to break it off of the pipe, which then I have to use either a little bit of water or a little bit of something colder to break it, and then break it into this big oven, which is about 900 degrees, and make a bunch of those things, and that slowly anneals to room temperature, which is like cooling it down to make it strong. And then once it comes out, I do this process where it's mirroring. So it's a chemical process that puts the shiny stuff on the inside of it. It's a long process, but it gets the job done. Maybe I should explain this piece over there a little bit. That's one of the older ones also, which had a maid to it. This piece over here is called Universal Conversions 2. The first one was Universal Conversions 1, and it's a whole dictionary. This one is actually a whole dictionary. It was the same dictionary that I had used. And this one is cut up into centimeter squares. The other one is cut up into inch squares. And I created this little shadow box and stacked them all in there. The other one had an etching on it as well. But the graphite, the drawing process is what got me thinking about this line, more of this line in the other works. So I like it because you can see some of the tabs in there. But this was more about words and language and how I like to deconstruct the meaning of things. Because
so you've only done 2 of those?
Yes. It took a long, long time. It was a unabridged dictionary, so cutting them up, centimeters and inches, and then handling them. Yeah, I don't know if I'll do another one.
And then placing them, it looks like you placed them in it.
Yeah, I made this shadow box where the glass was down on one, and so I ended up stacking them like little bits and then sitting there and then pushing them up. It's kind of a similar process of doing mosaics. If like really tiny mosaics where they are crushed up against each other versus the flat, so larger surfaces. But it's kind of about this idea of the metric system, US conversions, definitions, and how they can be swirled around and changed, lost in translation. And so I'm trying to break things down almost into a least common denominator.
Is this one of your perfect ones right here?
Nope, no. This is a piece that I've actually had another mate to it, which is fortunate. I'm gonna fix it later. But this is an idea that kind of is a newer piece where it's this unperfect thing, but you can look inside of it and it references what I call like an oculus and what I've been working with more right now. I used to study like architecture, and so for my thesis, I've been working with this idea of the culture sandwich and the idea of the oculus and how that becomes a funnel for everything. And it's something that orients you and disorients you at the same time. And so this idea of looking into something, seeing something that's distorted is what that's about. And it's a play on words also, black and blue. Kind of getting beat up by culture. Well, if that's it, I'll just hand it over to Courtney.